Welcome. My name is Joshua Noyer. I'm the founder and the chairman of the American Blackshirt Party, and I want to talk to you today about fascism and National Socialism and the differences between the two, and more importantly, why people consider these two very different ideologies one and the same thing, because it's a very, very big challenge facing fascism in its modern form. Speaking as a 21st century fascist, I would have to say that our greatest struggle is to combat the assertion that fascism and National Socialism are one and the same thing. For those that accept this idea, not only are the crimes of Nazi Germany, things like the Holocaust, the euthanasia program, which killed up to 100,000 people, the sterilization program, not only are these the responsibility of Hitler and his regime, but those who believe that these two ideologies are one and the same also accuse those allied with Nazi Germany of sharing in this moral responsibility because of this wartime alliance. If the wartime alliance between fascism and National Socialism creates an equivalency between the two regimes, then the obvious consequence is that the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States also created an equivalency between communism and democracy. I know a lot of us believe that both of these ideologies are derived from materialism, and I in particular agree with that, but they are not one and the same thing. They're very different in how they manifest themselves. This assertion is obviously absurd, and if applied to any alliance outside of the Axis, would have been rejected out of hand. So why do so many Americans take it as an act of faith that National Socialism and fascism are one and the same? As Americans, collectively speaking, we have a very incomplete knowledge of history. Anything outside of 1776 or the sphere of American influence lacks any historical importance, at least in the American mind. As a result, we like to take the central events in American history and use them as reference points from which to understand and articulate what's happening in the world today. When American military forces are deployed overseas, whether in Iraq or Syria, the leaders of these countries are always portrayed as being the next coming of Adolf Hitler, with the obvious implication being that if American military forces weren't deployed, then millions would die just like the Holocaust. In the political realm, just about every president since Lyndon Johnson has been accused of being a fascist. In 2016, presidential candidate Ben Carson used the Holocaust to argue against gun control, implying that if the Jews had been better armed, the Holocaust would have never happened. Obviously, World War II and Nazism in particular are still fresh in people's minds. It still helps to shape people's political thoughts and discourse. What defines this discourse is its irrationality, people's need to have a visible, clearly identifiable enemy to hate and make themselves feel better. By using logic and reason and separating regimes based upon ideology, would, in the minds of many, demystify World War II and complicate the hatred people feel towards fascism. It's much easier for life to imitate arts in the movies than to face reality. A lot of people have fascism as some kind of boogeyman, some kind of punching bag, which it gives them a certain amount of security to label this as some kind of ultimate evil that they're constantly fighting against. It gives them meaning and security to their lives. And so that's why it's so hard to break through this. I mean, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of legwork to get this done, because it's mental. It's in people's subconscious that fascism is this ungodly evil that they imagine it to be. So for fascism to break this toxic association, it's necessary to articulate the philosophical foundations of each ideology and where they diverge. National Socialism at its core is biologically racist in orientation. It believes that man is a product of his biological makeup, that his genes and his DNA determine not only his race, but his individuality. This foundation in biological racism creates the foundations from which everything else emanates from. It colors National Socialist thought on the proper role of the state, the nation, and its laws. I'm going to read a quote here from Hitler, and I want you to remember this because I'm going to read a quote later from Mussolini, which is going to which is going to draw a sharp contrast between these two individuals. The precondition for the existence of a higher humanity is not the state, but the nation possessing the necessary ability. So if race is central, then everything else plays second fiddle. As I just read in Hitler's quote, the state in National Socialism is a reflection of the people. It doesn't have value in itself. This is why National Socialism attracts such a large amount of small government types and libertarians. If you're familiar at all with this, with the ideology and the groups within it, you'll find a lot of debate and argument in regards to whether you want to have a large government, small government, and there's a lot of variation in it because National Socialism never held the state as being central. It was always a tool. It was always something imposed upon society for the benefit of the race. It did not exist for itself like it does in fascism. If immutable racial characteristics are what defines us, then there's at best a minimal need for the state. Overextension of state authority would only serve to disrupt the nature of the race. Had the Axis won the war, then this difference would have played out more clearly after 1945. And why there was some similarity between these two regimes during the 1930s is that both felt that there was a finite time that they had to address some of the problems facing their nations and to rearm and complete the revolutions that they had engaged in. And at least I know on the German side, even though the state was not central, the kind of situation it was put in necessitated an activist and an active government to implement Hitler's agenda. That's why in the 30s, other than aesthetically, these governments did have some kind of resemblance to each other. Since National Socialism in its centrality of National Socialists believe in the centrality of race determining our future, they have to have a rationale for moral degeneracy which infects even predominantly homogeneous nations. This is where anti-Semitism comes in. The Jews have always had positions of influence and wealth beyond their numbers, so when a country is in decline, they present a very easy and obvious target for people because people don't want to do research, they don't want to go through long, complicated answers to some of these problems, and the Jews have always been a convenient target. This is the situation which presented itself to Hitler not only in Weimar Germany, but when he was in Austria as well. He saw two of these great empires in decline, both containing a lot of Jews in positions of power. He therefore theorized that through subversion of the political system, the German race had been corrupted. The fact is, Nazi race theory is so shot through with holes and contradictions that rational explanations to explain things like national decline and moral decay often can't be made. As a result, conspiracies are cooked up which portray secret cabals of Jews coming up with schemes to take away the freedoms of Gentiles. So this ignorance that's inherent within National Socialism and its ideology led to a lot of conspiracy theories and what we like to call today fake news and false propaganda. And while we have the same problem in the United States, it's not directly based on anti-Semitism, but the same kind of ignorance which National Socialism is based upon also is infecting modern-day Americans who don't want to look into issues and problems and come up with rational explanations. They want easy answers. They want to believe that there's groups of people out there working in secret to undermine our freedom and liberty. And so all we have to do is take out these groups and voila, we'll be fine. So just replace the names of some of these groups with Jews. And so you have this similarity between modern day conspiratorial thought and National Socialism, and that's part of the danger here, is that what's going on in this country today can very easily lead to something similar to National Socialism later on, because the similarities in how the thought process goes. Now, fascists, on the other hand, give a central role to race in the development of their thought also. But their definition of race is much different than the one used by National Socialists. Whereas the latter viewed race as a biological construct, something which is immutable, fascists declare race to be spiritual, a cultural construct, a shared history, a way of life, a common view that they share a similar destiny with their neighbors. Fascist race theory requires a strong central agency to help mold and shape a people into a nation. It requires a strong state. While National Socialists attract a lot of ex-conservatives and libertarians because at its heart it's anti-statist, no such rationale can be used when describing fascism. Now let me read here a quote from Mussolini, which is going to contrast with National Socialist thought. "It is not the nation which generates the state, rather it is the state which creates the nation, conferring volition and therefore real life on a people made aware of their moral unity." Quite a significant difference from the way National Socialists think. To fascists, race is not a static concept. A race is in a constant state of development and evolution. It's alive. It's constantly evolving and changing itself. It's not immutable, because when it's immutable, it's a dead concept. It's not going to survive. If the state is the creator of the race and the nation, then it's implied that the state needs a means to carry out its task of unification. National Socialists believe this task is achieved through the Führer principle, which gives to the head of state complete authority, even above the law, whereas fascists believe that to establish a lasting foundation for a strong nation, the laws themselves need to be changed. So something like the corporate state, not only was it instituted because it was good economics, but because it changes productive relations, it affects the interactions between millions of people on a daily basis. Also, something like the youth groups, the leisure program, all of these affect people on a huge scale, and so it's not the nationalist rhetoric, it's not the populism which is so revolutionary in fascism. And it's more the laws, it's the institutions that are created, subtle things that change how we live our lives and our behaviors. Sometimes we don't even realize it, but it's doing a lot of good over time. Whereas in National Socialism, there wasn't a whole lot of influence put on these laws and institutions. I'm not saying they were completely ignored, because they weren't. But most of the revolutionary aspect in National Socialism was based upon the will of the Führer, or the leader. So you have a very big contrast there between the emphasis put on the laws in fascism and the emphasis put on the leader in National Socialism. The emphasis on law offers a sharp contrast between the two. National Socialism delves also into conspiracies and sensationalism to compensate for its lack of rationality. Fascism, because its recognition of the importance of law in creating unification, puts more emphasis on ideology as a causal factor behind world events. Again, if you go through fascist literature for up until about 1938, you see very, very few mentions of Jews, of secret groups trying to undermine national liberty. It's more concentrated on the effects of laws, of government systems, of ideology, and how that affects the national group. Whereas in National Socialism, you see this emphasis, this saturation of what we call the Jewish question, where Jews are made to be this boogeyman, which is responsible for many of the world's problems today. It's a big difference between the two. Now, the deviations in fascism which happened shortly before and during the war, such as anti-Semitism, were opportunistic in nature and mostly the result of structural pressures which the increase in German power was creating. I wrote an article a few months ago entitled "The Jewish Question," where I address many of these issues regarding fascism and Jews in greater detail. I encourage you to look through it and read it. Now, the Axis did not win the war, and this divergence of ideologies I mentioned earlier did not happen. So, in the end, I mean, it's purely theoretical at this point, but the wealth of fascist literature produced before the war should leave no doubt that fascism and National Socialism are not one and the same, but can exist of their own accord. And I encourage you to go through some of this fascist literature of the period, and then read some literature from National Socialist supporters and theoreticians who wrote during the 20s and 30s, and make up your own mind on this, because there is a wealth of information out there which can really differentiate between the two regimes. It's nice talking to you today about this. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you very much.